This video is for all pupils currently studying National 5 English, and the aim is to hopefully help you become a little bit more confident with the structure of how to answer the 8-mark textual analysis question. The first step in tackling the 8-mark question is to make sure that you have read the question carefully and you've identified or highlighted any key words from the question. So here is our example question, and from here you can hopefully see that the key words you should be picking out are characters, so main characters, and personal difficulties. So these are the things that you're going to have to focus on when you are coming up with your 8-mark answer. We're also imagining for this example question that we have been given Dear Santa as an extract. When you are given the textual analysis paper as part of an assessment, you won't be given an entire short story, you'll just be given an extract from one of the 4. But for this example, we're just imagining that we've been given Dear Santa. Now that we have identified the key words, we know that we're thinking about main characters and the personal difficulties that they face, we can move on to step 2, which is planning the stories that would be best for you to use in this answer. Obviously, as we've been given Dear Santa as our extract, we'll start with thinking about Dear Santa and how we see personal difficulties in that story. In Dear Santa, the main difficulty that Alison faces is that she feels that her mum doesn't care about her and that everyone prefers her sister to her. She thinks she's second best to her sister Katie. Now that we've covered how the extract relates to the question, we have to decide which other stories we want to use in our answer. And the best way to do this is to work through the other 3 stories and just think, how could they possibly relate to the question? How could they possibly show personal difficulties? So if we start with All That Glisters, we could say that a personal difficulty Claire has is that she has to deal with and try to process the devastating death of her father. Then, if we think about hieroglyphics, Mary's difficulty is that she really struggles in school due to her dyslexia, and she receives very little support from teachers for this. Lastly, if we think about Away in a Manger, which is probably the trickiest one to relate to this question, we could say that Sandra faces a personal difficulty in that she has to work really hard, long shifts in her job to ensure that she provides the best she can for her daughter Amy. Now that we've thought about the keywords and how the stories link to this question that we are being asked, we can now go ahead and practice using the 3 headings to structure our answer. I can't stress enough how important these headings are for structuring your answer. These are by far the best way to guarantee that you are going to get your full 8 marks. The first of the 3 headings that you're going to use is commonality. And under this heading, you can gain a maximum of 2 marks by stating how the extract relates to the question, and then also stating how the other stories you've chosen to discuss also relate to this question. Now here's an example of what you could write under the commonality heading for this question about personal difficulties to ensure that you gain the full 2 marks. So as you'll see, all you need is a simple sentence for the extract and then a simple sentence for each of the short stories you have chosen to discuss. Now I've put here that I'm going to discuss All That Glisters and hieroglyphics, but you'll have noticed in the question that it only says you have to look at least one other short story. So if you only wanted to look at All That Glisters, for example, or you only wanted to look at hieroglyphics, that's absolutely fine, but you'll see when we come on to our next heading that just means you'll have to have more quotes and references from the one story. Next up is our second heading, extract. Under here you will also gain a maximum of 2 marks, and you'll gain this by having a quote or a reference from the extract in front of you from the story that you have been given. For example, in this case we've been given Dear Santa, and an explanation of this quote or reference in relation to the question. It's probably a good time to mention here that when we say reference, this is more for if you can't remember a specific quote, but you can remember that there's a part in the story where something happens. So for example, if we think about Dear Santa, if you remembered that there's a point where Alison speaks about her mum not loving her, you could write that as the reference. if you think, oh, I can't remember exactly what was said, but I remember that was the meaning behind it, that could be your reference. But because we have the extract in front of us, really under this heading, you should be able to pick a quote. So here we have a quote from Dear Santa, which will achieve 1 mark. And then we have the explanation as well. So we are referring to personal difficulties, as that is what the question has asked us to do. And I've also picked out there as well a technique that has been used. So I've commented on a short sentence. And by all means, if you can spot a technique, maybe some word choice, imagery, sentence structure or tone that has been used in the quote you have chosen, then by all means pick that out and comment on it in your explanation. Just make sure that you link your whole explanation back to the question. So in this case, back to the personal difficulties faced by the characters. Then we move on to our third and final heading, which is other stories. And here you can achieve a maximum of 4 marks. And to do this, you have to have either 2 quotes or references from other stories and an explanation of each of these and how they relate to the question. Now this is when you may want to use a reference rather than a quote, because for this heading, you obviously don't have the stories that you're talking about in front of you. So if you can remember quotes, if you have them in your head, then great, you can use them by all means. But if you can't remember the quotes, please don't panic, you can just use references. So hopefully you can't remember the quotes, but you can remember parts of the story. So here is an example of a reference from All That Glisters. So we've said that Claire has an extremely close relationship with her dad, and when she's told that he has died, she doesn't want to believe this. So this is us paraphrasing, almost putting into our own words, the part of All That Glisters where Claire hears her own voice, and it's as if it's in a fog. But rather than quoting that, we have made reference to it, which we will get 1 mark for. Then I've linked this to the question by explaining why this is a personal difficulty for Claire, and this is how we achieve the 2nd mark. Then lastly, I've done the same for hieroglyphics. So again, I have a reference about how Mary struggles with reading and writing, and then I have an explanation of that reference and how it relates to the question for the last 2 marks. And there we have it. That is a full 8 mark example answer. Hopefully watching me work through how to use this structure will help you when structuring your own answers. I've also put in here some other tips for revising how to answer this 8 marker. The first one is to fill in a commonality grid. So your teacher has probably already put this onto your team. You might have filled it in already. If so, just read over that. But that is the best way to get the commonalities between each of the stories into your head. Next, it might seem obvious, but I've said a great place to start is to reread your short stories, or even just skim through them, as this will remind you of the similarities and the differences between each one. And finally, practice makes perfect. So the last thing to make sure you do is to practice lots of these questions. You can message your teacher and they can send you some example questions, or there are some on the SQE website. That's probably the best place to look first of all. Like everything, practice makes perfect. And the more questions you do and have marked and get feedback on, the more confident you will feel using the CEO headings.